And that's why the science is being attacked sometimes as well. You don't know what exactly is going to happen. It's like, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know when you put carbon dioxide in massive quantities into the atmosphere, you heat the earth up, and then you get consequences. And we've started to see the consequences now so clearly with specifically extreme weather, but even things like sea level rise that's already happening. That the debate about whether climate change is happening or not is for me as a teacher here anyway, long since over.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Facing Giants, where we explore stories of struggle, strength, and resilience to help encourage you in your fight against whatever giants you may be facing. Today I'm here with Dr. Paul Berger, and today we're going to be discussing a topic that I'm very, very excited to talk about. Today we'll be talking about climate change. Hello, Dr. Berger.
Hi, Craig. How are you?
I'm doing all right today. Before we get right into it, could you tell the people what it is you do and what qualifies you to share any opinions on this topic?
Oh, that's a good question. What do I do? I'm an on-the-street climate change activist with CUSP, Citizens United for a Sustainable Planet. I would say I'm on the street. It's Anishinaabe territory, and I always acknowledge that under the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850, and I always like to point out that Indigenous people would be protecting this land, just in the way they're living on it, and we're not doing such a good job of that. I think that's important to acknowledge. I'm also an associate professor here at Lakehead, and I teach climate change education at the master's level and teaching climate change to Bachelor of Education students who are going to go out and teach all kinds of different subjects. I do have a math science teaching background, but I didn't come to this through anything other than starting to read books as I got nervous about what we were doing to the planet. I think as far back as 2000, I knew about climate change. I knew that it was an issue. I was sort of loosely following it. But by 5 or 6 years later, I was reading books that started to make me pretty nervous. I ultimately read a ton of books. I love it. That's what I do before going to sleep at night. I read nonfiction books about climate change. And so my understanding of it has changed over time. My inbox is flooded with climate stuff all the time. And sometimes I feel like I'm not getting to my real work, but then my work is actually teaching about climate change education as well. So it all kind of works out.
Right. So at the master's level, what would a course in climate change aspire to accomplish? Like, what is it that you're trying to convey to these students, or what are you hoping to achieve at the end of the semester?
I take for granted now that people come into the class knowing that climate change is happening and being worried about it at some level. Maybe not very much, maybe a whole lot, but they know climate change is happening. They know it's a problem, but they don't know much more than that usually. So what I want the course to do is to get them close to the urgency of what's happening and the reasons that we need to act fast, not in a 50 or 100-year time scale, but quicker than that. Also to have them understand that they have some agency, that there are some things that they can do. They can be part of the climate movement, the climate justice movement, the climate fight. And so that they know some of how they might start teaching about climate change. Or in the master's case, many of them aren't going to be classroom teachers, but to communicate with others about it. So a public pedagogy kind of, how do you talk to your cranky uncle about it? How do you talk to your friends? Will you post something on social media about this now as you learn the urgency? So you'd think it might be a grim subject, but we have all kinds of momentum. And in the last few years with the huge influx of international students here, most of the master's classes are full of international students, and they bring experiences, firsthand experiences of things from all across the planet, which is really enriching as well.
Mm-hmm. So you rewind 10 to 15 years ago, Al Gore came out with The Inconvenient Truth. And I think that was the big documentary that kind of put climate change into people's vocabulary, kind of rang the alarm a bit about what it was and where it could head. And I remember a visual of like melting glaciers and the rising ocean, and it like completely covering cities that bordered oceans. And I found that kind of terrifying. And I remember, 5 years later from that, Donald Trump saying that climate change was a hoax. And I guess what I'm getting at here is like there's a lot of misinformation, mixed narratives about climate change. And I think at the end of this podcast, I'm hoping that people will get a better sense of what it is that's going on and where to find good information. So before we start heading that way, if you could do your best to describe or define what climate change is, global warming, like what is it that is happening that surrounds the terms that we're talking about here?
Sure, I'll try to be brief. Humans are burning fossil fuels at a huge rate and also cutting down trees and farming animals, especially cows. But really, fossil fuels are the bulk of the problem. We're digging up old carbon and we're burning it and putting it into the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is like a blanket that helps to keep the heat in from the earth. So at night, the earth is radiating heat away. In fact, it is all the time, but at night it's trying to radiate heat away. And the carbon dioxide molecules trap some of it and reflect it back to earth. So we need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we didn't have any, the planet would be about 30 degrees colder or something. We wouldn't be here at all. But when we put more carbon dioxide, and methane is another powerful greenhouse gas, when we thicken that blanket of heat trapping gas, we heat the planet inevitably. It's sort of grade 10 science, that mechanism. It's not really controversial. What has taken up a lot of oxygen, so to speak, is the idea of, well, what happens when the planet warms and how much will it warm? If we put X amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, what difference will that make? And because the climate system is incredibly complex with clouds and all kinds of feedback mechanisms, that's where some of the scientific discussion is, and why you see different graphs with like an upper and a lower bound of what they think will happen. And that's why the science is being attacked sometimes as well. You don't know what exactly is going to happen. It's like, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know when you put carbon dioxide in massive quantities into the atmosphere, you heat the earth up and then you get consequences. And we've started to see the consequences now so clearly with specifically extreme weather, but even things like sea level rise that's already happening. That the debate about whether climate change is happening or not is for me as a teacher here anyway, long since over. We seem to be seeing an acceleration and more damage, and it seems like some of the predictions we're getting the warming and impacts at the upper level of what scientists thought. So, it would be nice if it was at the lower bounds, but it looks like the upper bounds. And the concern for me, the main concern is it's not a linear thing. It's not like as we heat the planet, we're going to get a few more storms or a bit more flooding or those things that the overdeveloped world tends to be able to recover from. Like people die for sure and people suffer, but then the powerful economies move on, and that's not what's happening in less developed parts of the world. But that's not what we're going to get. We're going to get major tipping points, Earth tipping points shifting, dying off of the coral reefs, the Amazon rainforest changing to the Amazon savanna or the Amazon desert ultimately. Things that will make life on the planet not impossible probably for humans, but incredibly difficult, that will crash down our civilizations. That's not something that I thought a lot about 15 years ago, but as we keep progressing and we keep seeing the latest reports and we start seeing in real time what's actually happening, those are the trajectories that we see. And we see a political process that seems to say the right words sometimes about climate change, but is not making the real moves that it needs to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to slow down the problem that we just keep making worse. So I think I probably veered far off the initial, like what is just happening. Global warming was a term that was used because the average global temperature was increasing. That changed some years ago, and climate change has started to be used, and it's sort of more accurate because it's not just warming. That we are warming the planet, but that's changing the climate in various ways. It's changing the rainfall patterns. Wetter places get wetter. Drier places get drier. Sometimes places get colder in spots. So it is about change, but there are people that say, well, this was really, a gift to the fossil fuel industry because global warming sounded kind of bad and climate change sounds really neutral.
Right. You touched on a few things, and I hope to dive into them a little deeper, like particularly the solutions. I'm all about like, all right, great, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? So it sounds like the argument, but Paul, this is all a hoax. It sounds like anyone worth listening to nowadays would agree that the planet is indeed warming. But the next thing I often hear is like, well, how do you know it's man-made? How do you know that this isn't just a naturally occurring thing? So what would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, that science is just being settled. And as much as there's any debate about it on social media or in other places, it's not among scientists. There's no scientists debating that anymore. The scientific consensus has been clear for a long time. We know roughly how much carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere from humans. We know roughly how much carbon dioxide went into the atmosphere in previous times when there were big climate shifts, and how long the periods of time that carbon dioxide went into the atmosphere. And we can see we're pumping it in, like 10 times faster, 50 times faster. It's us. So, it used to be like, it's not happening. Then it was like, it's happening, but it's not humans. Then it's, okay, it's happening and it's humans, but it's not bad. And then it's like, okay, it's happening, it's humans and it's not bad, but it'll cost too much to fix it.
Right.
And now it's, okay, it's humans, it's happening, it's bad. We could pay to fix it, but actually it's too late.
Right.
It's like the denial or the not wanting to accept that we're actually doing something that's not good. It keeps changing form. And there aren't many people now saying it's not human activity. Even I heard, I don't typically listen to Jordan Peterson or Bjorn Lomborg, but I actually saw a clip from the two of them a while ago where Lomborg had to say to Jordan Peterson, well, no, like climate change is happening. Like I accept that it's happening. So even some of the people that we see as the biggest sort of forces now saying like we shouldn't take radical action, we shouldn't even reduce fossil fuel burning, let's say, accepts lots of the premises of what's happening. They just tend to now say, well, we're kind of stuck because we can't do anything and it's not going to be that bad.
Right. Yes, we will talk about Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomborg later, but it sounds like, again, anyone who's worth listening to, it sounds like climate change is a thing. And I think the consensus is that this is indeed a human-caused phenomenon. Another funny thing that I've heard in my research is that the Earth goes through cycles of heating and cooling, and we had an ice age, and now things are heating up, and we're going to have an ice age again. What would you say to that sort of argument? That sure, maybe we're making a contribution to heating, but the Earth is going to cool down again.
It's hard to argue with that because for me, it sounds ideological now if somebody's making that argument, but I want to take it seriously and I want to try to help the people through it. Yes, the Earth has gone through cycles. Yes, we've had ice ages and warming periods in between the ice ages. If that cycle were being followed now, the Earth should be cooling now because we should be starting to head into the next glacial period. Instead, the temperature is rising and it's going off the charts, and literally going off the charts. Like if you see the sea surface temperature in 2024, the line is so far above 2023, which was above the previous line, that it's like, okay, it's clear what's happening here. There's a strong warming trend. So there's a warming trend when there should have been a cooling trend. And some people will say, well, it's solar radiation. It's the sun is the thing that makes a difference, right? We just had a solar eclipse today, right? So it should have cooled the Earth a bit. And when I started teaching climate change, I thought I better read some of the climate denial stuff so I know what's in it. And I remember going and looking at a reference that said, the sun was responsible. And I looked at the paper that it came from, and it's like the sun is responsible for like 0.1 of a degree of the warming that we've seen. We've had about 1.2 degrees of warming. So a lot of these arguments take some kernel of truth, like the Earth has been warmer, the Earth has been cooler, and it seems emotionally like a good argument, and then they extrapolate it to a situation that it doesn't fit, right?
Right.
So we're pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We predict that would cause warming. We're observing the warming. there's nothing to me to suggest that we should think it's a natural process.
Hmm. Right. So funny enough, I was reading a book to my son today. It was about glaciers, and it did talk about the heating and the cooling of the earth, the ice age and the melting of the ice. And it sounds like those cycles from this book, and it was a kid's book, so take it for what it is. Um, the cycles were every 100,000 years. So it was like, all right, you know, I haven't looked at a calendar lately to see how far along we are, but it sounds like these things take a very long time to swing from cold to hot. And I think we've been heating the planet pretty rapidly. I remember looking at a graph, especially over the last 30 years. Like the incline on the graph was definitely increasing. So although there is some validity to this whole ice age argument, I think that time period is just way too slow to explain the rapid inflection that has been noticed over the last 30 years.
You just did a better job of explaining that than I did. That's exactly the thing. It's the geological time scale is about slow movements, and we've got a very rapid movement happening.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned Al Gore's film, and I've heard a statistic that half of the fossil fuel that humans have been burned since Al Gore's movie came out, right?
You're kidding.
Because everything's accelerating, right? The industrial processes, what we have, what we can access, everything is just ramping up. So we're sort of going in the wrong direction in that sense as well.
Yeah. But some would use that as a marker of human flourishing, because I guess you could loosely equate the burning of fuel to the creation of energy to the flourishing of humans. So I don't want to even go here because it feels icky to say, but is there an argument to be made that human flourishing is in conflict with the thriving of the planet?
That's a spectacular question that I'm going to answer both yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
If you see human flourishing as, if you think about the happiness research that says that what makes people happy is being connected to others, learning, being active, being in touch with your world, and giving, then all of those things, and if you see human happiness as being something about flourishing, all of those things can exist in a world where we're tackling climate change really aggressively.
Mm-hmm.
If you see human flourishing as having a lot of material things, being able to, to buy a whole bunch of clothes and wear it once or twice, and then it's falling apart and you throw it out, and buying big cars and having 5 vacations a year, and I'm actually slipping into like personalizing this as if it's individuals. It's really the big industrial processes and the super wealthy that are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions. So I never say to people, don't buy anything, or don't go on a vacation, or don't do the things that make you happy. But we are going to have to change some of the cultural things, the big processes, and the incredible wealth disparity we have that lets people fly around on private jets, emitting as much carbon in one flight as some people on the planet emit in their entire lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I was hoping to go there later, but I just felt like I had that was a big thing I was hearing a lot, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. And I do agree that it's all about stewardship. I think you're absolutely right that human flourishing doesn't have to conflict with the thriving of the planet. It's just we've got this awesome thing, we should take care of it type thing, right?
And if we're going to say, like, if we're going to say that the definition of flourishing is having the biggest car and a really big house at a second house, and like that flourishing is going to conflict with the planet.
Right.
We're not going to be, or we're not going to all be able to live like that. And so is it fair that just, some super elite lives like that and we're crashing the planet?
Right.
So, but I absolutely would agree with that framing that human flourishing isn't against, like, we can have a flourishing human civilizations, peoples, if we redefine a little bit what we mean by flourishing.
Right. So another thing that I hear in my 4 days of research is that CO2 in the air means that trees are going to grow means that less CO2 is going to be in the air. Pretty much the planet is equipped to handle this influx of CO2. And there was a report by NASA that the planet has greened 15% in the last 30 years, aka there's a growth of trees the size of the United States that has happened over the last 30 years because of all the CO2. So what are your thoughts on that argument? I heard that and I was like, that almost got me.
Yeah.
That one almost got me.
Okay, just before responding to that, I want to say that we're burning a lot of fossil fuel right now, and there's a lot of human suffering. Right, there's not a lot. I would say that especially for young people right now in Canada, where levels of climate anxiety are massive, and that's only one kind of anxiety, right? People are worried about can they afford a house, can they afford to eat. We're not seeing a lot of flourishing that we should be seeing for this super wealthy society. So we have some systemic problems as well as climate change. In terms of carbon dioxide as plant food, this is another one of those things that, like, yeah, of course, plants, trees need carbon dioxide to grow. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There have been studies that show that if you have a more carbon dioxide rich environment, trees will grow somewhat faster. But if it was true that they were growing faster enough to not make all our carbon dioxide spewing a problem, then the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere wouldn't be going up three parts per million every year. Like we've been measuring this really accurately since the 1950s, and we're at something like 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We were at 280 before the Industrial Revolution. That's a huge increase in a gas that traps heat. Mm-hmm. So yes, that's an example of a negative feedback loop that tends to ameliorate the problem, right? And it does happen to some extent, but like the solar radiation argument, it's so small as to not be significant given the rates of carbon dioxide that we're pumping out. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is we're cutting down trees like I'll get out, right? Like the Amazon, there's a new president that is slowing the deforestation, but we still think it's all right to cut down vast tracts of forest, and old growth forest in Canada is still being cut. Old growth forest sequesters way more carbon than new seedlings do. So, I mean, we know a lot of the things that we need to stop doing if we want to tackle this problem with the kind of seriousness that we need.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a bit and let's talk about the portrayal of climate change, global warming in the media. And I'm curious if you personally think that the media is too pessimistic. Is the messaging around climate change too apocalyptic, too pessimistic? Is it clickbaity? You said you weren't big on social media, so maybe you're not aware of kind of the climate change landscape in social media land. But overall, from the books you've read and from like the news, you know, like every week there's like this big hurricane thing that they're chalking up to climate change and droughts and things. Like, do you feel climate change narrative in the media is too pessimistic or apocalyptic?
Yeah, no. In fact, at first the media, whenever they covered climate change, they would have like, this is the person for it and this is the person against it, and the person saying it was human caused was usually Bill Nye the Science Guy. But for years, that's what the media always wanted to do, balanced coverage of the so-called debate about whether it was happening. Then there was a period that, you know, they would report on all kinds of extreme weather events, and they might say scientists think this might be related to climate change, but they would never say anything direct. Then what was called attribution science started to come on the scene, probably 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 10, where they do modeling that looks at how likely a certain storm with a certain strength would be, or a certain flooding would be if things were as they were before, and then how likely is it now? And then they report that. So they don't say this, you know, Hurricane Sandy was caused by climate change, but they'll say something like Hurricane Sandy was made 8 times more likely and was likely 50% stronger. I'm making those figures up. And so media is now more likely to say that something was caused by or was related to climate change than they did for ages. And still there've been some amazing studies. Something happened in 257 minutes about Jeff Bezos going into space on his own rocket. Just the coverage of that event. But the major news networks in that whole year had only had something like 280 minutes of coverage of climate change. So it's like billionaire guy goes into space and the media covers it like crazy. Climate change stuff happens. No, they don't cover it
Mhm.
that much. So I haven't heard much apocalyptic stuff on the legacy media, the mainstream legacy media, but they will report sometimes on the latest studies. Like that seems to be what grabs their attention. The latest study comes out, warming's faster than we thought, or hurricanes are more powerful or something. So that gives a sense of it's bad, but there's not great coverage of the climate solutions either, I don't think yet.
Mm.
And sometimes there's coverage that makes you think that, that electric cars are kind of terrible, or, the only reason you would buy an electric car is if it was, better for you personally. So I heard a current story the other day and I thought, well, where is somebody saying like, yeah, I have range anxiety because there's not enough charging stations. That's a political problem. But I bought the car anyway because I really wanted to stop emitting carbon dioxide because I'm terrified about climate change. Like
Mhm.
that part didn't come up at all. It wasn't even part of it. It's like, why would you buy an electric car now unless you were thinking about climate change? Because 95% of it's better, 5% of it's range anxiety. You don't want that. You want to be able to go to a gas station, right?
Yeah, it just seems like it depends where you get your information from, right? And I think there's just a lot of people on YouTube saying a lot of things. And I think lately the media has gotten a bad rap, deserved or undeserved. I'm not equipped to make that argument. But if you go on like YouTube and even with books, like there's just so much information out there. And I guess part of the end of this interview will be where you get your sources of information, but we won't go there just yet. I was curious about these tipping points that you were talking about, because in the mind of the unresearched individual, when you think of climate change getting out of hand and going too far, in my mind, I see volcanoes blowing up and lava like melting my house type thing, or hurricanes blowing over everything I love. So like what would be the mechanism if climate change were to get out of hand that would bring about our destruction? Is it our destruction, or is it just like an obstacle we have to overcome type thing?
I don't think humans are going extinct. There's mechanisms that could potentially trigger that. And I don't think there's a climate cliff that we're going to fall over. I think there's a climate slope that we're starting to go down. So we already see more extreme weather. We know the predictions are that will get worse. Again, that's not what my biggest concern is. My bigger concern is passing these tipping points that sort of lock in even further warming. So I mentioned the methane coming out of permafrost, melting the Arctic sea ice. The Arctic sea ice reflects a lot of sunlight, so the heat doesn't come onto the Earth. It gets reflected back out into space. As that ice melts and we have blue water instead, it's going to absorb heat. So it's going to increase the heating. There's stuff called methyl clathrates, which are methane molecules in the shallow ocean, in the Arctic Ocean, that are locked in ice crystals. They're going to melt and come out, increasing warming. When the Amazon changes towards a desert, it's going to mess things up badly. Mm-hmm. There's a big current that takes warm water up from the Gulf and it takes it up to the Arctic. And then that water ends up cooling down and sinking, and it takes oxygen down into the deep ocean. And then that comes back. That current now, people used to think humans can't affect that kind of thing. And now the prediction is that by 2050, it's possible that we're really disrupting it. There's already signs that it's slowing. And it's not really in my lifetime that I'm worried about those bigger effects. There are people who talk about, those things on really short timescales. I think that might be a bit alarmist. But to think that we're going to mess up some of those big systems within this century, and that it's going to lock it in for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, it won't come back. That I think is terrifying. And I hope that you and your kids will be safe your whole lives. But I think what you'll experience is real political instability as things get more and more stressed. If like there's 5 bread baskets in the world, in my understanding, like major places where more food is made than people eat, and they get shipped across the world. The American Midwest and the Canadian prairies is one of them. If we get extreme weather that hits like 3 of the 5 in the same year, we're going to be looking at lots of hungry people. When people are hungry, they tend to move. So one of the big predictions is that there'll be lots of movement from climate. People whose places they're living are now simply too hot. They can't grow food. They can't live there anymore. I hope that we deal with those disruptions openly and being partially responsible for the problem and welcoming people. But I think we might go towards a world where people are building walls all over the place. And then there's tension, and then there's politics. So I think your life is much more likely to be impacted really negatively by the politics and the conflict sort of thing that's happening than necessarily being caught in a flood or a fire in Thunder Bay. But both are possible. And again, it's not like I think 5 years from now or 10 years from now, everything's going to collapse. But I do think that if we don't make a serious course correction and start to do what the major scientific bodies say we need to do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that your children's future and your grandchildren's future doesn't look nearly as bright as I would like them to.
Mm-hmm. If I were to summarize or at least spin what you just said in another way, or like to the heart of what you just said, you're probably not viewing this like a volcano's gonna explode on my house, but more the best time to tackle this problem is today. And tomorrow's just going to be tougher than today if we don't do something about it. And as far as the tipping points go, once the point has tipped, it's not like the world's over. It's just to reverse this problem or to mitigate it or deal with it. It's just going to require more resources. So why not start today type thing?
Absolutely. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about like the refugees arriving on the southern border of the States that might be partially responsible for the phenomena of a Donald Trump coming along and saying, I'm going to build a wall, I'm going to keep those people out. Many of those people are moving from some pretty dramatic climate impacts that have really messed up their ability to grow food and feed themselves. Now, that's on top of, in some cases, fairly difficult regimes and dangerous situations that are apart from climate. But these things are intertwined. And the US military says climate change is a threat multiplier. So whatever's going bad gets worse when you throw in droughts and floods and big storms in the middle of it, right? So in a stress situation like in Syria, suddenly you have a 5-year drought, and then you have people moving into the cities, and then you have discontent youth, and then you have suddenly a Syrian civil war. And you can't say, well, climate change did that, but it was a factor at play in that situation. It made other things worse.
Mm-hmm. Right. It just adds fuel to the fire.
Yes.
Most people agree that this is a phenomenon. Most people agree that this is human caused. And most people agree that this is a problem that will require some effort on our part to solve. It seems the issue now where there's all this tension is on the scale of the problem. I still think there's a big debate on that, and the solutions. And if you can't agree on the scale, you won't agree on the solutions. Since this is a problem that involves that every human is implicated, this is a planet problem. There's going to be things that we can do on the individual level, but a lot of the muscle work is going to come from political action and probably global political action. And this may be a stupid question, but work with me. Do you feel like this is a individual accountability issue, or does this issue deserve to be in the hands of politicians?
So it's not something that an individual can solve on their own. Absolutely not. That doesn't mean what we do in our personal lives is unimportant. There's a bunch of reasons why I think it is that we could talk about. But I can't go outside and take a bus if there's no buses. If there's no public transit, I can't do that. So I will have to do something else, right? So some of the big things are definitely political problems to solve. Now, I do want to say the question that I think you might have retracted partly about the politicization. This is the most disappointing or discouraging thing I think about about climate change and the response to it. In Denmark, there's proportional representation in the voting. So it's not, one party wins, gets the most votes and they get to have all the power. It's always coalitions. It's always power sharing. They have probably the strongest climate law in the world, reducing greenhouse gas emissions 70% by 2030. It's like 11 of the 13 parties voted for it. They're squabbling over what the best way is to tackle things fastest. They're not, saying, I'm going to repeal your carbon tax if I get elected. You're making things too expensive for us. It's the politicization of it here is totally tragic. We have a government in power that's taken baby steps, that's not doing nearly enough, that's captured by industry, that won't push nearly as fast as it needs to. And now somehow another party that even wants to undo those things. It's a really, really dangerous situation. So I go back to Bill McKibben in terms of individuals. The main thing we need to do as individuals is not act as individuals, act as collectives to push for what we need. Because you and I can reduce our carbon footprints to zero, a carbon footprint, a concept that was popularized by British Petroleum to make us think that we're the problem. But what we need is big systems level change. We need the electricity grid to be clean so that as we electrify our homes, the things are being powered by clean electricity. We're super lucky up here in northwestern Ontario. We've got 3 big old dams on the Nipigon River that supply most of the power. Also a big wind farm, a solar park. We've got very low carbon energy here. So as we make the decisions to put in a heat pump, to change to an electric vehicle or hopefully a small one, to do those sorts of things, it makes a real difference, because instead of burning fossil fuel to get us places or to dry our clothes or whatever, suddenly we're using cleaner energy. But not everybody can do that. It's governments that need to make sure that those systems are green and that we have the electrical power transmission capacity that we're going to need, and those sorts of questions. They're all big structural issues. And I think our individual responsibility is to push governments to move faster on that.
Right. And I think those are all the issues you were just stating there, I think stems from this disconnect in the average Canadian that we don't agree on, or at least we don't know the scale or agree on the scale of the problem. Therefore, we can't agree on the solutions. Carbon taxes was implemented, and the way that most people will feel this is, you'll notice gas prices just jumped 30 points. I think it was 130, and on April 1st, it went to 160. Now, I don't know much about carbon taxes, but is this something that we should be feeling good about paying, because it's not cheap?
Yes. So, okay, I'm going to start at the beginning here and say a postdoc working under me a bunch of years ago did a survey and found that something like half of Canadians didn't know that greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels was the prime driver of climate change. They picked things like the hole in the ozone layer, or other things. Like they only had 5 choices, and like half of them didn't pick the right one.
Really?
That study was repeated, not with my colleague, but it was repeated again with the NGO that supported that in 2022. I think 54% got the right answer. That means 46% don't know the basic mechanism of climate change. So then you ask them to pay a carbon tax, and they don't really think, okay, carbon, that's what's causing the problem. If I pay more for this, I'll maybe use less of it. In my understanding, the $15 jump in the carbon price per ton added about 3.4 cents a liter to gas. So it might be that it jumped from $1.30 to $1.60 overnight. They probably timed that to make it seem like it was all the federal government's fault. The fossil fuel prices, there's one of the great joys of not owning a fossil fuel driven car anymore is I don't have to look at the price of gas. I don't have to give my money to the companies that have been working and lobbying like crazy to slow climate legislation. Those things make me happy. The range anxiety, not as much, but I can live with it. So yes, the government's been terrible at selling its carbon price. Lots of people don't realize, unless you don't file an income tax return, in which case they don't know where you are or how to send you money. If you file an income tax return, you get a rebate from that carbon tax that you pay. the carbon tax went up, and that money will be rebated back equally to everybody in Ontario that was part of paying that. 3/4 of the people will get more back than they spent at the gas pump. So they get quarterly payments. So in a way, you spend it a bit before you get it back, but you get the money back. It's in that way, it's not a tax. But the government's been terrible at selling it that way. And now it comes into like my bank account. I don't even get a check, so I don't even see it necessarily. That's really bad climate politics. Like they should have been really selling to people what they're doing, why they're doing it. It's not going to make people that it's 3 cents a liter more tomorrow or on April 1st. That's not going to make them run out and buy a different car. But when they know that the carbon price is going up $15 every year until 2030, and by then, like the entire carbon price will be 34 cents or somewhere like that on the price of your liter of gas, that starts to help change people's behavior. The Liberals have paid a big political price now for being open to being attacked from the Conservatives, partly because they withdrew the carbon tax on heating fuel in Atlantic Canada, which was kind of like saying, oh, you're right, this is making things too expensive. That wasn't the right message. The right message was, look, the people are getting more money back than they're paying. We're also, giving rebates for putting in heat pumps. So we're going to help those people get off oil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's been a hard one. And the carbon tax on its own, it's not enough. We should pay for pollution, but it's not going to be enough to get us where we need to go in terms of greenhouse gas reductions.
Right. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, but are you aware of any other governments that are implementing policies that you are in favor of? Are there any governments that you feel are attacking this problem the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. Uruguay, a little country in South America, has done an incredible amount to move its electricity grid onto renewable energy. It's not 100% renewable yet, but it's a little country. It's not a super wealthy country. Political decisions have made a vast transformation in 15 years. Costa Rica is mostly on renewable energy for their electricity. Portugal just ran for 10 days on renewable energy. It's possible to do these things. Denmark, almost half of their electricity comes from wind energy. Sweden pays people. Sweden's carbon tax, I think, is $160 a ton, like 3 times Canada's. So they're way ahead of us on that. They also took the tax off of getting like your washer and dryer repaired or your bicycle repaired, things like that, so that it nudges people to get to fixing those things instead of throwing them out and buying new things, right? Which saves the carbon of making the new things. So there's all kinds of things that are going right in different places, but they're not all in the same place, and people don't know a lot about them. In Norway, if you buy a new car today and you buy a gas car, you would be seen as very strange. You'd be like, under 10% of the new cars sold are internal combustion engines. And I think in 2025, they're not allowed to sell them anymore. That's so far ahead of where we are here that it's incredible.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the criticisms of electric vehicles? I've heard that their cobalt comes from mines, the batteries, the lithium's mined in China, and they use coal, and it produces all this CO2. Like, what are your thoughts about the criticisms of electric vehicles?
So first, full disclosure, I have an electric vehicle. I've had it for almost 2 years. It's the best thing I've ever driven. It's the most powerful. It's a little Kona electric. I would never buy anything other than an electric vehicle. But if we want to replace 1.5 billion vehicles with electric vehicles, it's going to be a huge burden on mining. If we want them to all be SUVs and big Hummers and things, it'll be way more mining. It's like we need to be thinking of public transit and smaller vehicles and alternative kinds of transport and active transport as much as we can. We should make it possible for people living in cities to not need a car or to have access to one in a car share kind of arrangement. So we don't need a car for everybody just sitting in their driveway. But in terms of the arguments against, it's like the climate denialism has shifted from it's not happening to, well, we can't solve it. Like all the solutions are bad. Mm-hmm. And that I think we have to resist. It's like, I hate the idea that a mineral would be mined in a way that creates human rights abuses. That's probably true of a lot of the minerals that are being mined, and certainly in people's cell phones, those minerals are there. And nobody said, well, we shouldn't have cell phones because of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ethical response would be we need to put pressure on our governments and companies to have supply chains that don't involve sweatshop kind of practices or child labor, that kind of thing. Yes, the car that I'm driving took more carbon. There's more carbon emitted to create it than the equivalent gas car, mostly because of the battery, the extra weight. But apparently after about 20,000 kilometers of driving without burning gas, then I reached the break-even point, and the rest of the life of the car means I'm overall emitting less carbon than if I bought a gas car.
Mm-hmm.
It's not free. I think if we think we're going to get through the climate bottleneck living exactly as we do, or continuing to get more and more wealth and gadgets and everything, that's going to make the transition just way harder. And we should be thinking about the things that make us happy and that are important, like connecting with other people. Like, remember the pandemic? Wasn't that much fun? We had to all sit in our houses alone and only connect over a screens. We can have really, really good lives and tackle climate change. We probably can't have opulent lifestyle of the rich and famous and tackle it. That being said, I still think we need to electrify the buses, the cars that are going to exist. We need to electrify them with pushes towards smaller cars and not having extravagance that doesn't make anybody happy.
Mm-hmm. We know that CO2 in the air, a decent amount comes from internal combustion engines. If we are looking for a future where we are hoping to decrease our CO2 emissions, even though it's got its dark side, the EV, especially with the increase in technology, we hope to get to a place where we can create EV cars for everyone the right way, but we've got to start somewhere type thing. So that's kind of my thought. And I think that's kind of where you were heading with it too. Back to like the carbon tax thing. And this is where guys like Jordan Peterson and guys like Bjorn Lomborg, it seems like the argument is, do we tax CO2 and make the poorest of us more vulnerable? Why not instead emit a little more CO2 so that we can bring up the wealth of the poorest among us? And then once we're all rich, we can then tackle climate change. It seems like that's the angle that those guys would prefer to tackle climate change from. I'm curious what your thought on that is.
Yeah, first of all, I think you've precisely summed up their major argument, and Bjorn Lomborg's been making it for 20 years, I think. Again, I'd like you to think about how much wealth there is on the planet and how many people are food insecure. Has the fact that we have incredible wealth, which is admittedly a lot because we've had cheap energy, because we've had fossil fuels that have provided enormous benefit, has that meant that we've gotten rid of food insecurity, solved world hunger? Lomborg would say things like, if we took the money that you want to spend on tackling climate change and we would spend it on malaria and getting people mosquito nets, we'd save many more people. And my thought was always, well, Bjorn, like, are we doing that? Are we doing that stuff? Like, does doing one mean that we can't do the other? I think we see the consequences of a corporate capitalist world where it's sort of every country for itself, and people aren't thriving. As to come back to what I said earlier, if fossil fuels was going to provide electricity grids to some of the poorest people on some of the continents that still don't have access to basic infrastructure, it would have happened. It hasn't happened now, but we can provide solar panels to people. They can point a piece of glass at the sun, and out the back flows electricity to charge the cell phones, to put a light on so their kids can read and study at night, and to have basic refrigeration so their food lasts longer. If we wait for the fossil fuel guys to solve this, we'll wait forever. I think it's really a red herring kind of argument. It just tries to take us away. We're also in a place that, like 10 years ago when they made that argument, we would have needed some real sacrifice to move to electrifying things and solar and wind energy. It was a lot more expensive than it is now. Like, the price of solar has fallen like 90% in the last decade. It's so cheap now that it's cheaper than producing electricity from natural gas. even in most parts of the world, if you have that infrastructure already in place to like the natural gas fired power plants. So we've gotten to the place where I think what's really holding us back is the massive fossil fuel lobby, partly the fact that humans aren't great with change and with fast change, but there's no trade-off to have now between the poor people that are going to die if we take climate action. We definitely have to do it smartly. Like the carbon tax and rebate, or carbon price and rebate in Canada, is meant to protect the poorer people. But, as long as we have the kind of inequality we have in Canada with kids still going to school hungry, that's still a concern. It's why we should be tackling those problems at the same time, not saying, climate's the biggest thing. And we should be looking at the inequity and big social issues sort of as a package and trying to solve them together.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring this down to the individual level. I'd say in the last 10 years, there's been like a big campaign on go vegetarian, ride your bicycle, don't use AC, lower your heat. Will those things make a big difference?
So the people who can afford to fuel switch, to switch from a gas car to an electric car, next time they need a car, I'm not saying they should, and I'm making an assumption here that people have a car. Not everyone has a car, clearly. If you don't have a car and you're able to not buy a car, that's the best thing you can do for climate. But if you're going to have a car and you can make the fuel switch, if you can switch to a heat pump, those things are going to be big and they're going to make a difference. They're going to be things that have to happen over the next couple of decades to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But I said like the people who can easily afford them, because that's not everybody. The people who can't easily afford those bigger changes, the one thing that is a pretty significant thing is how much meat they eat. So moving towards a plant-based diet can be really helpful. You're not going to solve the climate crisis by moving towards a plant-based diet on your own, but the climate crisis won't be solved if we replace all the energy generation with clean energy, and the world trend to eat more and more and more meat keeps going up, unless the cows really can eat seaweed and stop belching, which might be possible.
Is that a real option, like cows eating seaweed?
There's a seaweed supplement that they've been testing that seems to mean that they don't produce nearly as much methane, which is the main driver of climate change. The secondary thing is cutting down Amazon rainforest to farm soya to feed to cattle. It's a lot more efficient to grow food for humans to eat instead of to grow food for animals to eat for humans to eat. But that being said, I've never once as a climate activist had a sign saying, be vegetarian or don't eat as much meat, because I don't want to personalize it and individualize it. And you and I, as I said, we can cut our carbon footprint to zero, and that won't solve things if the rest of the world charges on as it is. So I would rather people join me once in a while on the street or emailing our member of parliament or our members of provincial parliament and raise the pressure to change the big systems, knowing that we're going to have to make some changes along with it, but also knowing that most of those things are going to make our lives better. Right. If we've got more active transit, if we have healthy eating, if we have more time to connect with others, if we have cities that don't have, lots of car noise, like they just have the road noise of the tires, but not the engines, and don't have the tailpipe exhaust, like the city is going to be pretty nice.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if we got really good bus transit, which we're far from, but
totally,
we have a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, it seems like, unfortunately, the majority of citizens of our country, city, province, whatever, aren't accustomed to political action, aren't accustomed to writing letters to people who can make a difference, like politically. And I wonder if that is just the hurdle that we need to just get over. Like even me personally, like there's things that I'm unhappy with, but the thought of writing a letter to my member of parliament representative, that's not a real option in my head. And maybe that's something I just need to get over. But I imagine the majority of Canadians aren't used to taking that kind of action, although it sounds like that's the one that's needed.
I think you're right. And I think of my own sort of trajectory here. The first time I was on the street, I was nervous. I was wondering if police would come. I didn't know how things would go. I thought, people might think I was an idiot. And then I got positive feedback from a couple of people. I was like, oh, Paul, that was great that you did that. And that's been the whole trajectory of being an activist, is that I've come to also not see that I'm putting people out by sending a message saying, we're going to meet on the street in front of Patty Haidu's office. I'm actually giving them an opportunity to be part of something, to express a concern that they have in a way that might feel better than sitting at home, not, feeling just powerless, like I don't know what to do. I'll admit right away that, like, we've been doing this for over 10 years now, different things, but lots of, being on the street in front of politicians' places. And sometimes it feels like we're not making any progress. On Saturday, we were in front of RBC for probably the fourth time or something, because they're huge supporters of fossil fuel. They've been lending money to pipelines that are crossing Indigenous land, and they're the worst fossil bank in Canada. And sometimes, I think, oh, we're doing it again and again and nothing's happening. And then we hear about some small victory, like they've agreed to report from now on how much money they're lending to fossil fuel projects and how much energy they're lending to renewable energy projects. A shareholder resolution was made, and it looks like they think that it would have passed, and that would have been embarrassing. So they've agreed to do it so they don't have to have that shareholder motion. Mm-hmm. Then I think, okay, so we've been on the street a bunch of times. We don't know what it's done, but it's been part of creating that climate of RBC now has to do something. Mm-hmm. And it's a baby step for them. We need a lot more. But, in part, I don't know what else to do. I've got books on my shelf from people that say, like, we have to not just be peaceful anymore. We have to do civil disobedience. We have to even do sabotage. Like, if they're building a new pipeline near you, you should feel totally, go down and drill holes in it. And the logic there is, if you live in a high-rise building and somebody's planted a bomb in the basement, you have the right to go down and take the bomb apart, even if the people that planted it there happen to live higher up in the building and plan to escape in a helicopter. Mm-hmm. I'm sympathetic to that, but there's no new pipeline being built close by. Right. And I don't know, I don't know if push came to shove how it would be with that, but and we haven't locked ourselves to banks yet. There have been scientists that have done that. Been young people in Britain that have thrown soup on paintings.
Yeah, I've seen that. Glued themselves to
and glued themselves to roads. There's people in jail in England under new draconian laws that, like, they're in jail for 2 years for blocking traffic basically on a motorway, because they're terrified about what's happening in the world and the world that they're going to inherit. So, yeah, I think you're right, though. It's hard. The first time I emailed, even signed an online petition, I wondered, like, is this safe? Is this okay? Mm-hmm. Once you start to do it, it gets easier, I think. And we don't know what will work, but we sort of know that if we don't do anything, it won't work.
Right. What is the role of innovation in this fight? Because to some, innovation is the answer. It kind of says that, don't worry, the sophistication of technology is just increasing at such a quick pace that we will find a solution to fix this problem. Don't worry. Continue as you're doing. We found a solution for HIV with antiretrovirals. We found, fertilizer during the Green Revolution. We found, all these things. We will find a solution for this. How do you put innovation into the equation to solving this problem?
So the first thing I would say is that innovation has been incredibly important, and we have found the solutions to solve the problem. What we're lacking is the political will to do it. Mm-hmm. Right? We know we can generate electricity from wind and sun. It can be competitive. It can be cheaper. We know the battery technology is one of those technologies that's getting better in leaps and bounds. Like my car, I have a 420 kilometer range. That's the advertised range. It's 500 in the summer, 280 in the cold in the winter. We're going to end up with cars that can go 1,000 kilometers and be recharged in 10 minutes. That's like the cell phone in your pocket is going to keep getting better and better. It's just right. That's going to happen. But we have the technologies that we need already. There's a bit of work to do on decarbonizing cement and steel making, and big ocean shipping. We know how to do it, but it's expensive still. There's going to be breakthroughs that help to make things easier and easier. But we've done the innovation we need to do what we need to do. We need the political will to do it. And to anybody that wants to say, I'm willing to gamble the next, 50,000 years of the Earth's climate and, most of the creatures on the Earth, including most humans, that we're going to find a magic bullet to pull carbon out of the air for almost free, that to me is a really dangerous gamble. It's like,
Mm-hmm. So my time in public health. So I've got a degree in public health. Whenever you're trying to solve a problem, it was always drilled in that the best solution is a multifaceted solution. I guess to apply it to this context, a public health practitioner would say, while we wait for technology, we continue to decrease our CO2. And those together will get us to a better place than if we were to do one or the other. I have about 15 more questions here, and we won't get there. So I guess what I will ask you is what keeps you optimistic? Are you optimistic about how this is all going to play out? And if so, what keeps you optimistic?
if you look at the trajectory and you look at the data and you look at the politics currently, you'd have to be a little bit discouraged. There's no way to do that and not think we are in a big mess. This is not an easy thing. We're not going to just solve this. If you look at that data and say we're not going to solve this, I'm going to back out of trying, we're for sure not going to solve it. Mm-hmm. So in part, I'm not sure about optimism, but the possibility of seeing that a better outcome can be had by engaging is always there. They sort of say, well, we're not going to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, but 1.6 is better than 1.7, and 1.7 is a lot less suffering than 1.8. Like, giving up isn't an option. We have a lot of possibility to still impact how things turn out. And what I have seen, especially over the last 5 years, is a massive change in the discourse around climate change and people's willingness. Like, if I'd asked my students 5 years ago to post something about climate on their social media, a few of them would do it, but many of them would be terrified. Mm-hmm. Now, even without asking them, a bunch of them are chatting and putting things up and telling their friends in India or China or wherever they're from about what they've done in the climate class. It's a very different thing to teach about it. It's a very different thing to talk about it. Even though I feel like the political process is gridlocked and it's not where it needs to be, in a way, it's a lot more fun to be a climate activist than it was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. When a lot more people were like, oh, are you sure it's really happening? It's like, now that people know it's happening, Greta Thunberg was amazing for raising awareness of people. The Fridays for Future strikes, bringing one of them 7 million people maybe out across the world. This is, nobody can say that they don't know about it now. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you said, like on social media, you'll still get attacks and people saying that's not real. And there's lots of people that don't have a solid enough understanding of it to want to engage. But I think we might be near a social tipping point as well, where it just becomes impossible, let's say, for a politician in Canada to not have at least some kind of climate policy that's more than just our current leader of the opposition saying, we'll innovate, mm-hmm. right? So that gives me some hope that I do see things different. And I can teach a climate change class with all this kind of bad news, and people are super excited and they go and they talk about it to people. And I don't know if they leave the class, the odd one I hear from later, and I know they've actually done things in their teaching or outside. That's nourishing for me to see the enthusiasm that people have when they see the depth of the problem and see some of the solutions that are available as well.
Right. In my quest for understanding on this topic, I grew very frustrated because it was hard to assess the quality of the information that I was getting, because it seems like everyone's got a strong opinion about this. And I'm wondering, where can people go to get good, solid, reliable information?
I would say the Guardian newspaper, which is available for free. You have to read a lot of their things of like, are you going to contribute to support us? They've got really good climate reporting. They report on the newest sort of climate reports that come out, and at a level where you don't have to go and read the science because they explain it to you. So that would be one site. If you have questions about any of the denial kinds of arguments, there's a great website called Skeptical Science that's run by a bunch of like NASA climate scientists, and they talk about all the myths and how to debunk them at a basic, an intermediate, and an expert level. So you can choose to engage where you need to in terms of what people are telling you. Then there's I end up getting a bunch of interesting newsletters, one called Minimum Viable Planet that the person just writes every once in a while. But there's other ones that sort of younger people that are climate interested or climate journalists write that I think are pretty solid and really interesting as well. Yeah, you can get any opinion you want confirmed on the internet for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So be careful of the source. And as I heard on CBC on the way in today, like if it's an influencer, are they trying to sell you something? What are they trying to sell you? Maybe they're just trying to sell your attention to their advertisers.
Mm-hmm.
But so they're trying to make things seem as extreme or outrageous as possible. That might not be really helpful for us right now. We've got a lot of work to do, but we don't need to over dramatize things. And if people are telling you it's not a problem or, whatever solution doesn't work, I would think about going to different sources.
Right. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our interview. I very much enjoyed talking to you today, and I've learned a ton. I was just wondering if you had any parting words for anyone who is either like frustrated with the polarization of this discussion, or if there was someone who felt they wanted to take action but didn't know where to start. What would you say to those two people? People who was frustrated with the polarization and people who want to take action but don't know where to start?
I think I'd say the same to both of them, that if you're frustrated about anything, engage, become active, and even in small ways, and then you'll feel part of things in a different way than a bystander that's just hearing different opinions and feeling like you're not doing anything. So earlier we talked about individual actions versus sort of collective group actions. One of the things that individual actions are really good for is making people feel part of something. So, and I'm not talking about, freezing yourself in your house or becoming vegan overnight. But, let's say you love meat, you're a really heavy meat eater, and you decide to have meatless Mondays, just as to something to try. So you build up a repertoire of plant-based meals. It seems like as soon as you do that, you're more likely to also engage politically, is what research suggests. So, but doing things makes us feel less powerless than not doing anything. And it also can send the message to others, I care about this, and you can end up having other people to talk to, let's say. I mean, finding other people that are at the same level of understanding as you to talk to about it, or that will explain things to you in a gentle way, I think is also really, really important. And if you are wanting to step in and start doing things, well, my suggestion would be send me an email and I'll put you on our Citizens United for a Sustainable Planet email list. And then, basically I send out when there's a climate event going on here, or sometimes if city council's voting on something and we need people to send emails to city councilors, we don't flood your inbox. We don't have a treasurer. We don't ask for money. But we're trying to sort of coordinate and make sure that people in town know what's happening. So that they can take part if they'd like to. I've said to people, would you think of coming? Oh, somebody will be breaking windows. And it's like, come on, this is Thunder Bay. Like there won't be cops. There won't be broken windows. There'll be a good vibe and colorful signs, and we'll send a message. And, we invite anybody to join us.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to talk to us today and for sharing your knowledge and your perspectives, because many, like myself, I'm very confused about this topic, and hopefully this discussion can help point someone in the right direction.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, have a great evening. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening and for supporting the show. Stay tuned for more empowering stories. If you have any questions for the guests or feedback for the show, email them to facinggiantspodcast@gmail.com. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well.